So back in 2014, I jumped ship from Canon. I moved over to Sony when I bought the 36 megapixel Sony A7R. Now, this video is going to be my exhaustive 3-year review of the Sony A7R and how I like it after 3 years. So I don't do gear reviews too often, but if you like them, let me know by either liking the video or subscribing, and that way I'll know to come out with more content like this. So just a little bit of background on this camera. The Sony A7R was released in December of 2013 at a price of $2,300, and it was also released alongside the standard Sony A7. Now, I bought mine 9 months later in September of 2014, and I actually bought it used on B&H for I think $1,800. Now, I have no clue who owned the camera before. I don't even know how many shutter actuations were on the camera before I purchased it, but it's been a trooper. It's been doing really, really well for me for the last 3 years. And I haven't been like keeping this in a little sealed box. I mean, I've actually been bringing it out to dirty places. I've been hiking with it. I've been in the snow with it, and it's still been holding up. Now, if you're watching this video, you're probably more concerned with how this camera has held up over the past 3 years, because this is kind of a little bit of a unique review of this camera. Now, I'm going to start off with the negative things because I think that it's important to know what was wrong with the camera versus what went right with the camera, because there are far fewer things that are wrong with the camera than are right with the camera. So the first thing I'm going to be talking about is the build of this camera. So the Sony A7R has a magnesium alloy body, which kind of keeps it feeling like rugged and sturdy while also keeping the lightweight, because that's one of the major features of the camera, its weight. Now, in a lot of the literature that I've been reading on this camera, it mentions over and over that it is dust resistant and moisture resistant. Now, to be completely honest, I've never really introduced this to any sort of like real moisture like rain, because I just don't think it's worth getting a camera ruined just to test out if it is in fact moisture resistant. However, with the dust resistance, I do have a few words to say about this. I've always been a little bit skeptical of the dust resistant claims, especially when I brought it out to Antelope Canyon. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Antelope Canyon, it's an incredibly popular photography spot, but one of the things you might not know about it is that it's incredibly dirty down there. Now, I brought my Sony A7R with me. It was one of the first major trips I went on with the camera, and I decided to go and take photos in the canyon, because why not? Now, when I went in there, it was basically being buried in a thin layer of dirt as I shot, and the dust actually really did get to the camera while I was shooting in the canyon, and some of the issues with the dust still kind of persist today. A lot of the issues, well, actually, the only issues that still persist, and actually the only issues that it really had, were dust getting in some of the selector knobs on the front, selector knobs on the back, and then the dial wheel on the back also had a lot of dust in it, and one of the buttons still doesn't really click properly to this day. Now, this is something that you would kind of expect to happen with any sort of camera or electronic equipment that gets absolutely covered in dirt, that, maybe some of the rotating pieces might not rotate as smoothly. Now, I can't really knock Sony for that, because obviously I don't think it was ever designed with the intent to have the camera absolutely covered in dirt. But with that being said, most of the dirt has worked its way out. Honestly, I don't even notice it anymore. But it is something that you do want to keep in mind with these Sony cameras, is that the dirt will kind of affect its actual functions that you would expect to be functioning normally on your camera. Now, a second problem with not necessarily this camera in specific, but I think with all mirrorless cameras, is that even if they are marked dust resistant, you are going to be having a lot of issues with dust, especially the mirrorless E-mount cameras, and I'll tell you why. So with a normal camera, you actually have like a mirror, a shutter, a couple layers of defense between the outside elements and the sensor in the back. Now, with a mirrorless camera, when you take the lens off, you're looking directly into the sensor, and with the E-mount cameras specifically, the lenses are mounted so close to the sensor that when you pop the lens off, any dust or dirt in the air has a direct path right to the sensor. And if you haven't seen my sensor cleaning video, I actually show you how dirty this sensor got over the course of 3 years without a sensor cleaning. And while you should be getting your sensor cleaned more often than 3 years, it's pretty shocking how dirty this sensor did end up getting over its lifetime. Now, I think one of the most well-known issues with this camera is the battery life. And I'm a little bit 50-50 on whether or not this is an issue, but I will tell you that I have had problems with the batteries, but not necessarily in the way you would think. Now, a couple years ago, I brought this camera out to Yosemite National Park, and it was on New Year's, so obviously it was freezing cold because it was at the beginning of January, and there was snow all over the ground. Now, I brought it out at, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 a.m. To go get the sunrise, and I had my camera just, out on my tripod as I was walking around, and the temperatures were ranging anywhere from like 10 to 15 degrees Fahrenheit, and obviously very, very cold. And one of the issues I did have with this camera was that the battery actually froze. Now, it wasn't permanently damaged or anything, but when the battery froze, I had absolutely zero power left in the battery. So I was basically left without a camera. Luckily, I did have a second battery with me, and it was in my pocket, so it was nice and warm. I swapped that out, put the frozen battery in my pocket, warmed it up, and it's been totally fine ever since. But it is something that you do need to be aware of, because I'm not really sure how maybe some of the competitors like Nikon and Canon, how their cameras will perform in freezing cold temperatures. But it is something that I have experienced, and I think it is important to note. Now, a lot of people do say that this camera has absolutely atrocious battery life, and I think where that comes from is the fact that you can't turn this camera off when it's on, if that makes any sense. Basically, you always have a screen running on this camera when it's turned on, either in the electronic viewfinder or on the viewing screen on the back. And while that does eat a lot of battery, I do think that the major downfall to this camera is just the physical size of the batteries, because the camera is meant to be a small form factor camera, so it has to have a small battery to fit in the small camera. So with a smaller battery means less battery life. Now, I've usually been able to get maybe a couple hundred shots out of a single battery. I think the last time I completely used up a battery was doing some headshots, and I shot maybe 250 or 300 shots using a single battery. And that's like a 3-year-old battery that was still able to perform at that rate. So, if that's something that you want to invest in, I would definitely recommend at least buying a second battery that you can have charging while you are using the other battery. Okay, so enough bashing on the camera. Now I'm going to be talking about the good parts of the camera. So when I was in the market for a new camera, I was actually looking to buy the Nikon D800E, which is also a 36 megapixel camera, obviously from Nikon. I was ready to sell off all my Canon stuff, including all of my lenses, all of my camera gear, and I was gonna go buy the Nikon D800E. So I was in the camera store, and I was asking the sales guy behind the counter if I could check out one of the D800Es, just see how it felt in my hand. And after checking it out for a while, it was cool, but he did mention to me that Sony had their A7R. Now, I'd never even heard of the A7R. I was completely unaware of Sony's existence in the E-mount world, and just the fact that they had some new cameras out. And so I checked it out. Obviously, one of the things that was most difficult for me to get used to was the size of it. And when I held it in my hand, it felt like a little toy. I couldn't believe that this guy was even suggesting that I should check out this camera in a serious way. But he told me it has basically the same sensor as the Nikon D800E, the 36 megapixel and no anti-aliasing filter. And he also told me that it was a lot cheaper and I could use my Canon glass. Now, it almost sounded too good to be true, so I went home, did a little bit of research on it, and over the next few months, I was basically completely obsessed with the cameras until I eventually bought it myself. And I'll tell you, I cannot say enough good things about this camera. It has served me incredibly, incredibly well over the past 3 years, and it still shocks me today how well this camera performs. This camera is absolutely incredible, and I'm not saying that lightly. I truly believe this is probably one of the best cameras that's come out in the last 10 years. And while you might be saying, yeah, but it's a 4-year-old camera, it's not relevant anymore, I would beg to differ, because this camera, while it's true it is a 4-year-old camera, it's still a great camera. It hasn't gotten worse since it came out. It's still a 36 megapixel camera, it still takes excellent photos, and there's only a handful of cameras out there that can actually compete with this Sony A7R. So before I made this video, I went on to DxOMark, which is a camera and lens rating website, just to kind of see how this camera stacks up with some of the current cameras. Now, I was incredibly surprised to see how well this camera stacks up to cameras compared to today. Now, keep in mind this camera is 4 years old, and it still beat out some of the newer cameras like the Canon 5DSR, which is one of Canon's flagship cameras. It beats out even the Sony A9, which is Sony's new camera. Granted, it does have different features, but just to put that into perspective, this is the 7th best camera that they've ever rated, and people don't even talk about this camera anymore. Like it's, kind of a forgotten piece of camera history, but it's still completely relevant and still does hold up to some of the modern cameras that are coming out within the last couple years. So one of the great things about this camera being completely overlooked is that you can get it for very, very cheap. Now, I was on B&H's website earlier today just to kind of see what they're going for used now, and you can get one of these Sony A7Rs, one of the bodies, for $1,300. $1,300 will get you one of these. And, like I was saying, these cameras are on par with some of the best cameras being produced today, and you can get it for a fraction of the price. That's about $1,000 less than this was brand new, that you can get it right now on B&H. So if you aren't adventurous enough to check out some of those used cameras, I will put like an Amazon link in the description for a brand new Sony A7R, which goes for about $1,800, but I would highly, highly recommend at least checking out just to see what the options are for a used Sony A7R. So despite this camera's flaws, like its dusty sensor, its freezing batteries, I have been incredibly happy with this camera. It's really held its own, especially after 4 years of, heavy use. I couldn't be happier with the camera. And that's actually saying a lot when you take into account the breakneck pace that camera technology is moving at right now. It's not uncommon to see cameras like this be completely overlooked within a year because something much better has come out. With that being said, I do think that photographers looking back on cameras, a few years from now, will be looking at the Sony A7 line as one of the best lines of cameras ever made. Just like people do with like the Canon 5D Mark II, people will be looking at these cameras and remembering how great they actually were. So if you guys like this video, let me know down below. Give me a like, subscribe to this video if you liked it, and I'm going to be doing a series of videos from now on with a little bit of gear review because I've got a lot of gear and I think that some people would find that very valuable. So once again, I do want to thank you guys for watching this entire video, and I will see you on the next one. you.